The members of the CFA Society UK who attended the group's March event in London were in for a special treat. Jerome Booth, chairman of New Sparta, talked about the reluctance of Western investors to recognize the growing influence of emerging market countries on the global economy and our future financial security. He illustrated his arguments with anecdotes and quotes from a variety of disciplines, ranging from science to philosophy.
We have a world where people believe what they want to believe, and it's very difficult to change people's beliefs. And in science, it's just the truth that most people do not work things out from first principles. And so you stand, as Newton says, on the shoulders of giants. You do something because others have done it that way before. The difference between science, as defined by Popper, science, he says, is thus. You cannot prove any theory. You can only disprove, on the basis of evidence, a hypothesis. But if something's not testable, then that's simply not science. In economics, Milton Friedman said much the same thing. He said that if you have unrealistic assumptions and non-testable results, then it's not kind of very useful. And I would say that 90% of finance theory, whilst maybe academically or heuristically useful, basically falls into that category. And the real error is taking that and then using it inappropriately. And that has caused, in my view, a massive distortion in asset allocation. This has affected hundreds of millions of people.
Dr. Booth has compiled his ideas and theories in a new book entitled Emerging Markets in an Upside-Down World, Challenging Perceptions in Asset Allocation and Investment. In this comprehensive work, the emerging market evangelist argues that finance theory has misrepresented risk and led to imprudent investment decisions by global fund managers.
It took me a long time to write the book, and I think I went through 9 drafts, because emerging markets is all about prejudice, and I wanted to get everything in. And not have people say, oh, yes, well, that's true, but. We have a lot of buts at the moment about China. In 2002, it was Brazil, but, everybody has to have a reason not to invest in emerging markets because it's a prejudice. And prejudice is a part of our lives we have ticked the box in, we don't think.
In addition to describing the complex and changing global environment currently facing investors and asset allocators, Jerome Booth challenges some well-established traditional finance and economic dogmas.
We all know in our heart of hearts, the moment we operate in the market environment, a lot of what we learn in theory, we know is just unusable. So when I read that, for example, one of the things that really got my hackles going was actually where it said in a book, the capital asset pricing model doesn't really work in practice, but it's well grounded in theory. No, it's not! Richard Roll demonstrated very clearly in 1977 that the Fisher-Black equation was entirely circular. It's therefore not subject to any disproof. It is not science. It is not okay in theory. Absolutely the opposite.
In fact, as opposite as it gets. The source of many problems, according to Dr. Booth, is a throwaway quote from the 1950s by American economist Harry Markowitz.
Markowitz wrote a monogram of 360 pages in 1959. And he talks about how the variability of a stock price can be understood in terms of the variability of that, or the idiosyncratic risk. He's talking about volatility, but he calls it risk. The idiosyncratic movement, which is not correlated to anything, stock-specific. The covariances or correlations to other stocks, and a correlation to an index. And this is one line. He then says, but for computational ease, we will ignore the correlations to other stocks. But this, I think, is behind a lot of our, erroneous thinking about the role of asset classes, for example. The idea that asset classes are somehow representative or building blocks in an asset allocation process. I don't believe they are. In fact, I think that asset class or indices should not be used at all under any circumstances in the process of asset allocation.
The vigorous economic rise during the last 2 decades of Brazil, China, India, and Russia, to name just a few, is threatening to overturn certain established practices that have traditionally served Western interests.
The flow today from emerging market savers to the United States is still the big flow. So when you read in the press about, taper tantrums and, the threat of interest rates in the United States causing, problems for emerging markets, most of that's nonsense. If I'm a central bank and I got $300 billion in reserves, that means I can intervene and change my exchange rate at will anytime I want. Remember, Algeria has more reserves than the United States, right? The United States is not a reserve player. They just print money. They don't have anybody else's reserves. Usable reserves, non-IMF, non-gold. They don't really have very much. So we are talking about a world where the net creditors, over 85% now of reserves in central banks, are owned by emerging market central banks.
Commodity spot rates, as well as the prices of manufactured goods and some services for that matter, are increasingly set by emerging market countries rather than by the developed world. Therefore, low inflation no longer guarantees economic stability, and consumer prices no longer provide an accurate picture of domestic monetary conditions. Western perception of risk is faulty.
All countries are risky. Emerging markets are the ones where that risk is perceived, where it's priced in. It's the developed markets where the risk is not perceived and not priced in. And that's actually where most of the risk is today.
The massive accumulation of foreign exchange reserves in emerging market countries has pushed down long-term interest rates, creating artificially distorted capital markets that offer little to the ordinary investor. What makes matters worse, according to Dr. Booth, the big global asset allocators are turning a blind eye to the situation.
This is people not really having a model. When we have the dollar just goes up and up and up against the euro every day, and we have people saying, oh, well, the fundamentals mean it shouldn't move up again. We all know that's wrong. We know it's going to move up again. Why? Because this has got nothing to do with fundamentals. The idea that things are priced in is nonsense. People are, if they started to really think about fundamentals, it'll scare them so much that they just don't know what to do. Because the fundamentals speak for themselves. Debt to GDP, fiscal stuff, negative yields. There is no significant, credible scenario where a buy and hold investor for a gilt or a treasury or a bund is ever going to get their money back. There's no credible scenario.
A thorn in Dr. Booth's side is the status of the US dollar as the global reserve currency.
It starts with something called the Triffin dilemma, which I'm not going to define, but it's to do with the internal and external imbalance inconsistencies when you have a central bank which is a central bank to the world and to a single country, in this case the United States. Basically, if there are the global and the domestic economy are growing at different rates, say the international economy is growing faster, that requires an increase in the money supply, otherwise you get stagnation. And if the money is all printed in the US, how do you get it to the rest of the world? Well, if you're not careful, you do it through a build-up, an imbalance, a build-up in the liabilities of that country. And we have this huge centrality of one currency, which is very, very unhealthy and very destabilizing. And the point is that when you've got huge debts on one side and you've got one creditor with this problem of having a central bank, which is effectively central bank of the world, you are going to get the same problem again. And that's exactly where we are today.
Dr. Booth fully understands that his book is not going to get Western asset allocators to change their herd mentality and deeply ingrained habits. He also knows that the integration of emerging economies into the global market will produce losers alongside the winners. But first and foremost, he wants his readers to question the traditional theories of finance and economic policy making in order to base their investment decisions on fundamentals rather than on social conventions.
So my book is a call for people to start thinking strategically, to start emplacing particularly macroeconomics, looking at the structural problems in the global economy at the front. So I ask questions like, look at your assumptions. You're assuming sometimes that volatility is the same as risk. Under these circumstances, it might be a counter indicator. Under these circumstances, you just don't want to assume that anyway. But in other circumstances, it might be a good proxy. So just work out when your assumptions, when your models are relevant, when they're not.
Jerome Booth does not see himself as a prophet of doom. In fact, he calls himself an optimist. And, while predicting a dramatic redistribution of capital accompanied by an erosion of the West's relative economic power, he encourages Europeans and Americans to seize the opportunities afforded by the new upside-down world in order to avoid a rapid end to our cozy expectations of ever-rising living standards.